Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who's an attorney and a senior pastor of the Queensboro Seventh-day Adventist Church in New York City. We also have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Relations for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have with us Judith Hawkins, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today and looking forward to our conversation. You know, we're trying to deal with this concept that I was reading about the other day, and it was talking about Christianity versus effective altruism. You know, there seemed to be a whole lot of drama surrounding when Sam Altman was kind of ousted from OpenAI, and he was listed in a position where he had done so much work. He had been an Oscar-winning filmmaker, but for some reason, this drama started to cast a spotlight on the philosophy of OpenAI. You know, according to the Center for effective altruism is about using evidence and reason to figure out how to benefit others as much as possible and taking action on that basis. However, when you continue to look at effective altruism, there's also a question of whether or not there should be a what I would call fundamentally utilitarian outlook with a special emphasis on the idea that because lives are equally valuable, that we should be in a situation where scientifically calculated information shouldn't maximize the input. So as a result, effective altruists have been promoters of caution, ethical consideration in the AI world. And as a result thereof, the question from a Christian perspective is, should Christians of all people be in a position where their moral dimensions of technology, knowing that the dangers of grasping recklessly as it relates to technology can completely throw things awry? You know, Bettina, when we kind of look at the idea what the role of Christianity is, and we look at it in the age of an altruism movement, and you think about all the activities that's going on regarding AI and the roles we should play, it seems as though the average Christian doesn't really know where they fit in this or whether or not they completely understand what the concepts of Christianity may be as it relates to altruism. What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right, Orland. This is a really complex philosophical framework that we're talking about here, effective altruism. You're right also, it has a very narrow focus on primarily utilitarian, practical, evidence-based considerations. And it's measured by a very narrow focus also on what the outcomes are in terms of what has achieved the greatest good for the most number of people. It all sounds like a marvelous thing. And let me put on the record here, I have absolutely no complaints about rich folks coming together to discuss how to give their money away. I think that's a fantastic idea. But I think this movement lacks something significant, and that is a comprehensive moral framework that introduces values beyond the utilitarian values like compassion, values like the recognition of individual worth, individuals as more than just statistics. And so I think the absence of that moral framework in this whole movement is concerning, because in effect it makes altruism sort of like rich folk sitting in front of a chessboard and moving the chess pieces around, and it doesn't have this sort of more holistic understanding of what charitable giving and oversight is really meant to achieve.
I found this topic kind of challenging, and I looked at it from a totally different way. I don't know if it's that different, but I thought about it in terms of Christian value of stewardship. And I came up with 3 reasons that it gives me heartburns. Number one, it's man-driven. Man originated the idea. But biblical stewardship comes from God in the Garden of Eden, making Adam responsible for the earth and by extension, everything going along with it. And the Bible puts forth some very strong responsibilities, and they're as simple as leaving extra grain when they were doing the reaping. God said that we were to take care of the widow, the orphans, the poor. And I like that because God says that he would repay. So there's a spiritual implication here that's beyond morality. It goes really to God looking at our characters and trying to deal with our selfishness and our covetousness. There's another point that gave me heartburn, and that is the one of it's based on man's analysis of who should receive the benefits. Okay, they're making those determinations. And the Bible sometimes deals with multitudes and sometimes it doesn't. It goes to a wholly different principle. For instance, it requires a faith component. Look at the tithing process of Malachi 3. Look at the disciples saying, how are we going to feed this many people? And the little boy comes up with his fish and his loaves and he does it. And the other thing came out of it is that there's a real difference in the outcome. There's a difference between effective altruism and Christian-based stewardship. And Jesus points this out because sometimes he would go through a town and there would not be a sick person left. But many times he only dealt with one person, the value of one. And the effectiveness of that one shows that there's a kingdom agenda. So when you talk about the woman at the well, she goes back, she brings the men, then the town comes. And as a result, when Jesus comes back through, the whole town is looking for him. He does not one miracle, but the whole town was affected. And so it bothers me because there's not a real emphasis on the value of the impact of one. Or my favorite one is the eunuch in Acts 8. Philip talked to one man, but because of that one man, a whole country was introduced to the gospel. So I'm kind of struggling with it.
You know, Arlen, I was just going to say, so my pastor preached on stewardship, Christian stewardship, just this last week. So that's exactly where my mind went when we talked about this topic too. And this is a new topic for me. I was not familiar with effective altruism previously. But I love the points that my two colleagues just made as far as just that what it really seems to be missing is the recognition of the individual and the individual needs. And when I was thinking about my pastor's sermon, one of the things that he was talking as far as what motivates us as Christians in the stewardship realm is our relation. It's that relational experience, right? It's not transactional. It's not because it's, you know, the numbers have added up and things like that. It's because it's an expression of our relationship with God, but then also in giving beyond the tithe with our offerings and our charitable giving, all altars, is our relationship with the broader community, with our fellow man. So, yeah, I think that I agree with my two colleagues that that's definitely an absence as far as, I think, longevity of such a movement.
So let me tell you what I think about when a topic like this comes up. I heard about an attempt that folk made to make water more watery. Stay with me. I'm going somewhere. They got the bright idea. Now, everybody knows the formula for water. You can say it in your sleep, H2O. Somebody got the bright idea to add an extra O to the water. And like we always do when we try to one-up anything that God has done, all we do is mess it up. Turns out that the extra O was moving stuff through a person's system so fast that before the body could take advantage of some of the things it needed to do, it was already on its way out. And I said to myself, will we never get the memo? When it comes to a topic like this, once again, folks have tried to make Jesus less Jesus and maybe more palatable to a secular crowd. But at the end of the day, all we end up doing is taking a concept and getting halfway there with it and missing the most important elements of what's going on. And I just got to say, when I look at a topic like this and I realize what they're trying to do, it gives new meaning to a verse that you could probably wake up 3 o'clock in the morning and say. The Bible says we walk by faith and not by sight. And now, in light of what's happening with all these attempts to take artificial intelligence and make it do all of these other wonderful things, the fact is, seeing is not believing. And we've got to identify the principles that God gave us and let those principles guide our conduct, because clearly what we see can be manipulated in ways that people think they're doing something good or think they're doing something wonderful, and all they're really doing is adding an extra O to water, and water is no longer working the way it's supposed to work.
I got to ask you this question, though. When you think about the idea that when you think about altruism, a lot of it is what we would call evidentiary based. You know, for those of us who went to law school and understand the importance of evidence, the idea that your reasoning for doing it doesn't matter, it's just the end result has an evidence that makes sense. I mean, in the society that we live in, is that so bad a thing when you have so many components of society that probably don't want to do things for the right reason, but they just want to do it because it has a good result?
So, Orlin, and you've identified a key issue here. I think religious charitable giving and approach to charitable giving can benefit from some of the principles in effective altruism, because yes, we do want to approach these things in a way that isn't wasteful, that is the best use of the money. But what I worry about, Orlin, is that, you know, you dig a little bit under the surface of this movement, and you see philosophers such as Peter Singer, who is the key philosopher who's sort of given this movement life. He's an Australian, but let's not hold that against him. And he wrote a book back in the 1970s called Animal Liberation. And in it, he basically said that there is no moral difference between looking after the interests of a suffering human and looking after the interests of, say, a suffering pig, because they're both sentient beings and they're both suffering. So when you take this sort of reductionist approach, where you reduce everything down to a very utilitarian approach, you get these blurrings between the specialness of humanity and other concerns. And that, I think, is the key part of this movement that we should consider. What are its fundamental underpinnings? And I think they're quite clear if you're prepared to do a little digging.
Judge Hawkins, what would not give you heartburn? I heard what gave you heartburn. What would not give you heartburn in this concept?
I'm having heartburn across the board, because even when we talk about it would be nice to use the analytics that they're using, God doesn't work on those kinds of analytics. He just doesn't. He doesn't. So from a scriptural point of view, I'm real leery of trying to use artificial intelligence to decide how to do God's work. That's my personal experience.
Well, I'm gonna have to let that be the last word on this, but it's amazing how people have just looked at our world from a results-oriented standpoint, in which supposedly your heart doesn't even matter anymore, and that might be the biggest problem going on in our world today. So hopefully we can see some adjustments to that. You know, there's a court case that's called St. Mary Catholic Parish versus Roy. And in that case, the Colorado legislature, and we've heard a lot of issues with the Colorado legislature, but the legislature created a universal preschool funding program that is supposed to provide all parents of all pre-kindergartners with 15 hours per week of free preschool education at a private or public school of their choice. Colorado's Department of Early Childhood, however, has blocked parents who desire to send their kids to Catholic preschools from participating in the program. The department did this by imposing requirements on its universal preschool funding program that categorically excluded many religious preschools, including Catholic preschools, from participating. You know, we've seen a number of these type of cases where we start to realize that there are benefits that individuals get from being a part of this program, but for some reason, when a religious connection is actually made, all of a sudden everybody decides that there's a problem. And as a result, we have some Catholic parents that actually had to come to sue to stop this religious-based exclusion. You know, Judge Hawkins, when I hear these type of stories and you start to juxtapose the idea of what something's supposed to be universal except for the religious groups. It almost makes it seem like the term universal is being an oxymoron of some sort, and in reality, it's for just the group that we think it should be for. But on the other hand, should it be a situation where you exclude religious organizations as it relates to the use of taxpayer funding? Maybe I'm missing this in some way. Judge, kind of give us some clarity on this.
We got a couple sub-issues here. The first one is we shouldn't be calling it universal, because when you call it universal, by definition, universal means everybody gets to participate, and that includes religious schools. I think, though, we're downstream. We need to go back upstream. And I'm still bothered by the fact that we seem to, and our Supreme Court is doing this, that they're opening the way for public funds to be used for religious schools. And I think that if we start there, we do a totally different analysis. And it's becoming, I like the word a slippery slope. It is becoming a slippery slope to the point that there are court cases now in parts of the USA where the religious schools are providing the education for the district. And I think that that is fundamentally wrong. And so we're downstream here talking about the universal. And I think that Colorado has a problem that when they created the statute, and I didn't have a chance to really distinguish whether or not it's the implications of how, not the implication, but the implementation of how they're doing the statute versus what the statute actually says. But this merging of church and state is, I think it's becoming, I'm trying to find a nice political word for it.
Well, Judge, I think you are absolutely right, because these Catholic preschools, I think they are on the correct side of current constitutional interpretation. I mean, clearly the Supreme Court has been heading down this path for a number of years now. Espinoza, 2020, Carson v. Macon, 2022. They've made it very clear that once a state sets up a program which funds secular private education, it cannot exclude religious private schools. It simply cannot. That's the constitutional jurisprudence, but I think the judge is right. I think the preschools are on the wrong side of history, because history tells us that when we try to force open the faucet of state funding and let it flow to religious schools, we end up with problems such as attempts to regulate, government oversight. We see schools losing their religious character as they try to fit in with the requirements to keep receiving the funding. We see financial dependency as religious institutions become, dependent on that government handout that keeps coming their way. This is not a healthy state for religious schools. So I think the Colorado program is inherently discriminatory. I think there's a lot of anti-religion animus there. But I don't think the schools should be in the business of trying to force that funding.
There's something else here that bothers me. We're taking public funds away from public schools. And we're talking about the decline of public education. Well, what do you expect if you're taking public funds away from public schools and now you're subsidizing all of the private parochial schools? To me, that's like, we need a strong public education, and we cannot have strong public schools if that dollar is being shared amongst all of the parochial private schools.
There's another problem here. These trends are not growing out of thin air. These are not things that are just happening, by some whim. What's going on here is a calculated effort to rewrite clear history, because it is clear that the founders of this nation were intentional in their desire to see a country that, while it may have spiritual elements, it is based on clear separation of church and state. And they had excellent reasons for wanting to do that. And so when I hear people trying to rewrite the narrative and try to sell me sixes for nines, well, this country was always, built on certain principles and this idea of separation was never there. No, I'm sorry. You really are engaging revisionist history when you try to go down that road. And that thought process is what is largely pushing the discussion here when it comes to our schools. And the fact that these efforts to get religious schools to be able to benefit from public dollars, to me, it is all springing out of the same toxic soil, where this idea that you should not have the separation and things should be allowed to operate a certain way. And that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because the founding fathers got it right. They all were coming from some very bad outcomes when you didn't separate church and state. And so for people today to be willingly and woefully ignorant of the problems inherent in their flawed design, it says to me that the wrong thing is driving the car here. And the outcomes are never good when certain principles are ignored or just out and out violated.
You know, I'm listening to Lawrence, and I was thinking, oh, how times has changed as far as what motivates us as lawmakers, as citizens, as religious people. You know, I agree with, and I was just going to say, you know, his description of our founding fathers and their reason, their rationale for establishing that wall between separation of church and state. They may not have used that phrase, but of course they absolutely did that with the two religion clauses in the Constitution. But you know, Lawrence was saying, Pastor Brown was saying, you know, it's because they were very deliberate in that, and that's because they so valued their faith. And now, you know, they did not want to mix the sacred and the profane, right? They saw those as two different spheres, two different areas. And now what we're seeing as a culture is we are seeing people actually either wanting to bring those two things together to elevate a certain, you know, to favor a certain religion or a certain belief system, or separate them because they do not value religion or religious principles at all. And so it's just a completely different mindset that we're living in now. I agree with what Bettina said as far as there's what's legal right now, thanks to the Supreme Court and the direction that it's going, but there's also what's right. And I agree with all of the panelists there as far as saying, you know, we as people of faith, you know, our values and our traditions and our doctrines are so important to us that we will sacrificially contribute and give in order to be able to for that to be a substantial part of our children's education, and instead of thinking that that's something that the government should provide for us.
Arlen, the other thing that bothers me with this slippery slope is that as much as we are hiding it, the truth is there are preferred religions. And when you move away from the preferred religions, then you don't have the same outcome. And one of the things, don't tell anybody that a judge said this, but judges have been known to decide the outcome and then write the opinion to support where they want to go. And I'm really afraid that where we're going now in our jurisprudence is that the judges have already decided the outcome, starting with the Supreme Court and working its way down. They've decided the outcome, and they're letting nothing, stare decisis, history, historical truths, facts, stop them from going that way. They just spin it. They're spinning, no offense, but they're spinning these orders.
Wow. So Bettina, is the real issue here the semantics of the use of the word universal? Because maybe if I don't use universal and I simply say that this is only available to public schools, it might create a different fight. But I think the clarity might be a little bit more specific and have even less concerns. I mean, is that what we're really talking about here?
I don't know if that would fix the problem, because you have all the preschool age parents in the state in a situation where they see the government holding out money. I think it's up to $15,000 a year per student, and they want that. And so I don't know if the nomenclature is really at issue here. I think that it is the principle of what we're trying to achieve with public education, what religious schools are trying to achieve with their religious mission in education, and what we are prepared as people of faith to sacrifice to keep that mission alive. So, Orlin, I predict that we're going to see not just another episode of this, but many, many more in the coming months and years.
But I think you raised one great point, Bettina, where it's the question of sacrifice. What are you willing to give up? And there are people who want to have all of the resources and no sacrifice. And I think the question is, when you're starting to make decisions and choices that are supposed to be based on some type of discipline of who you really are, then sometimes you will have to give up those dollars that are sitting there just simply because it's the right thing for one to do. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
You see the picture of Tallahassee behind me is the home of Florida A&M University with the marching 100, and the university sits on the highest hill, which is not very high, in Tallahassee.
Didn't know that. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Orlin, we were talking about giving earlier. Did you know that America is one of the most generous nations on earth? We give at a rate of 2.5 times more than people in Great Britain and more than 8 times people living in Germany. So I think that's a reason to be proud.
Yes, it is. Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Our first segment referenced AI, artificial intelligence. But with the shocking increase of artificial intelligence being used to sexually harass others, it makes me wonder if artificial intelligence is really that intelligent after all.
Wow, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, I'm going to be on the same lines as Bettina and talk about giving patterns, but specifically about Christian Americans. Orlin, did you know that 1 in 5 Christians regularly return a tithe and offering?
Actually, I thought it'd be a lower number, so clearly didn't know that one. Listen, good having you guys here with us. Great conversation. I think we're going to be talking about some of these same topics down the road. Thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.